So what was being a good communist supposed to be?
Doing what the paper told you. I mean, if the paper said this was going on, this is what was going on. And just doing as you were told, I think, was the best definition. It made a whole point to his life. I mean, he had no life without the paper at all.
There was a big upsurge in party membership, I mean relatively big upsurge, so that the Daily Worker could expand its coverage a bit and put on an extra page or two here and there, although it was always in financial difficulty. But it was, in a sense, it became more narrow after the war, I think, because it reflected so closely the events in the Soviet Union. You must remember that after the war, two things happened. First of all, there was the declaration of the Cold War. And secondly, Stalin battened down all the hatches and got rid of people. The only way that Daily Worker could survive was by sending about 50,000 copies every day to the Soviet Union for sale, which was the only English newspaper allowed to be sold there. So it couldn't step out of line with Stalin. So there was a big problem there.
The erstwhile ally was again the enemy. The Berlin blockade blasted the brief alliance. Caught up in the cult of Stalin, the Daily Worker grieved for the great genius, described by one of his victims as a 20th century Genghis Khan. In 1956, the Soviet Union began to tell itself the truth. At the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, Khrushchev made a speech in the closed session, known as the secret speech, denouncing Stalin's terror. Foreign correspondents like the paper's man in Moscow, Sam Russell, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, weren't let in on the secret speech. But somehow his friend Dennis Ogden was.
I attended a Communist Party meeting at which Khrushchev's secret speech was read, together with two other British communists who were working at the publishing house at that time. And this was at shortly after the 20th Congress. And after the meeting, on the very day, the next day, we had lunch with Sam Russell and told him about it, and I gave him a written account of it, but based on memory, because we weren't allowed to take notes during the reading. And this, I think, formed the basis for Sam's subsequent discussion with the paper.
Sam Russell sent the story, a scoop, but the paper published instead an at best ambiguous report. He still has his carbon copy of the unpublished scoop on the secret speech. You had really the fullest text that by then was available. Why do you think the Daily Worker didn't publish it?
Well, they found it impossible to come to terms with the idea that Stalin was a bloodthirsty monster. And this was not only a problem for foreign Communist Party leaders. There were Russians, Soviet citizens, members of the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party, who were arrested, tortured, and who all the time thought that this was done without Stalin knowing about it. The great, good Stalin could not have done it. This must be done by some agents of British intelligence who'd smuggled their way into the NKVD. I mean, for example, from this secret speech, there was the cases of Eicher, Postishev and Kosyov were examined in detail. In the case of the two former, extremely moving letters were reproduced in the report, in which the writers point out to Stalin that they'd been tortured beyond endurance and denied that they had in any way opposed the party or the Soviet state. They appealed to Stalin for consideration of their case by the Central Committee, and where they were released, they were shot. They didn't know that it was Stalin who'd ordered it all. They thought that Stalin could not have done that. And the British communist leaders, as communist leaders elsewhere, found it impossible to come to terms with this fact, even though they wouldn't go to the extent to say that Sam Russell had invented all this or lied, or they may have thought that Sam Russell had become the victim of some plot by British intelligence or the CIA or something. I don't know.
Khrushchev's assault on Stalin hadn't been heard either by foreign communist leaders. George Matthews was one of the British party leaders kept out of the closed session.
We were inevitably associated in people's minds with the regimes that had committed these crimes and blunders and all the rest of it, and therefore, obviously, it created a great problem for the party and for its relationship with the British people. All we could do was say at the time what we felt to be right and what we felt to be wrong, and where we recognized we'd made mistakes, to say so. I mean, I don't think we were forthcoming enough, particularly after the 20th Congress, in recognizing the mistakes and saying that we were wrong. We did it to a certain extent, but there was quite an effort to try to minimize, really, both the degree to which things had gone wrong under Stalin and the extent of our complicity with them.
More than 3 months after the Congress, Fleet Street got the story.
I always felt that if we did have a revolution in Britain, it would be very different to be British. Didn't mean that you're going to follow Stalin's way at all. It may be a bit of equivocating and dissembling there, but if you're working in a political situation, you don't have to agree with everything the party does, and you don't have to stop your work in one part because the other part doesn't add up.
What did you feel when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary, though?
Devastated.
While the British government invaded Suez, the Soviet Union sent tanks into Hungary to quash rank-and-file revolt. The Daily Worker sent one of its most reliable reporters, Peter Fryer. His dispatches, passionately sympathetic to the uprising, were suppressed. Still a communist, he quit the paper, and communists would have had to turn to the Daily Express to find out why. I could not work for a paper which sent me on a momentous assignment and then did not use my dispatches.
I don't think the first one was printed at all. Parts of the second one were printed. And he says in his book that I blue penciled it to ribbons, if I remember rightly. Actually, I don't really remember. I'm quite sure, because although I was then the assistant secretary of the party, Johnny Campbell, the editor of the paper, was in Moscow, and so I was sent to help Mick Bennett, the assistant editor of the paper, at that time. I may well have subbed the story. I think the third dispatch wasn't published. Now, again, it was understandable at the time why there was a feeling they shouldn't be published, because it's totally contrary to the estimate that was being made by the party and the paper of the situation in Hungary. Totally contrary. I mean, Peter just saw the popular side of it and more or less discounted the anti-socialist side of it. And so his dispatches were very pro the revolt. And so, you know, there was an obvious feeling among people that, but looking back, I think they should have been published.
So I drew a cartoon because at that time, one must remember again that people might not, Eden had gone into Suez. So you had the two things. So I thought the best way to do it was to put two things together. So I had the invasion of Suez and the invasion of Hungary on the same level as acts of aggression. The editorial staff was split almost 50-50. I think there were about 16 people in the editorial, and 8 went and 8 stayed. And some stayed because they just sort of couldn't give up the past type of thing. Some of them weren't bad, really. But It was the end of the road.
The cartoon wasn't printed. Gabriel quit.